some harsh words for Judah and Israel. And these are the prophets. This is Amos, who may have been the first prophet, actually. A lot of people feel that this is probably the earliest of the prophets, was Amos. And, you know, before we get into that, I just wanted to really point out how harsh those words are. And I chose those on purpose today. So we can read something that's very harsh, and we'll get into that in a minute. First, I actually want to show you something, if Matt can put something up on the screen for us. And this is something that you might recognize, of course, from Micah 6:8, from another one of the prophets. What does the Lord require of us? To seek justice, love mercy or kindness, and walk humbly with God. And this is a lot of the crux of the prophet's message, also of Jesus' message. If there's nothing else you need to know as a disciple of Jesus Christ, it's probably this. And as we walk along the path of being followers of Christ, we have to find ways that we do these things. And, you know, I've listed some of these things underneath here. Under justice, we have O&A, open and affirming. You know, if you're involved with the open and affirming ministries of any kind here, that is part of seeking for justice. Faith, the organization that we're talking about sometimes. Being involved with local justice issues. Also, you know, remember, like, we used to do protests, Black Lives Matter protests a few years ago, back when, after George Floyd's death and Breonna Taylor. The letter writing that we did last week, talking about the educational standards, and a lot of you sent in letters, that's part of justice too. It's about addressing the systemic problems in the world. Loving kindness and mercy. A lot of us are involved with gifts of love or colors of hunger. Those are acts of mercy, of taking care of people, right? Of love. The thrift store too. Smyrna Cares. Some people have gotten involved with Smyrna Cares, which helps provide relief for people that are in financial trouble. And walking humbly is what we try to do in here on Sundays, right? We worship. We worship and we pray. And we do Bible study and we do leadership. Leadership like the stewardship that we're doing today over the gift that we've been given. That's part of walking humbly, right? Finding out ways to honor God in our lives. So this is just something that I'm going to be talking about over the next several weeks. Actually, I'm going to spend 3 weeks talking about justice, 3 weeks talking about kindness, and 3 weeks talking about walking humbly. So we can learn how to walk that path. By the way, early Christians they called their path, they didn't call it Christianity, they called it the way. A path, which is so similar to a lot of other ancient religions. Taoism called it the Tao, which means path or way. Buddhists and Hindus call it Dharma, the Dharma, which also means, you know, pathway. It means a way. So think about that road that we're walking on. And as we get into Amos, this is one of the things that we're going to start out. Next week, we're going to talk about Amos also. But first, I want to relate to you again, you know, a story of my teenage rocker youth. My favorite band growing up was Pearl Jam. I was right at that age, and a lot of people these days are like, but why? But you had to be there, and Pearl Jam remains a favorite band of mine. And I've got the pictures to prove it, because when I was 16, I looked like I belonged in the band. I had hair down to here, and then goatee, and it's, you know. I have the picture. I didn't put it up there. Oh, we should have put it up there. If you need to see it, I got it on my phone. I've got proof. But one of the things that happened that Pearl Jam did is that they had a hit song called Jeremy. And it was probably around 1994, 3 or so when this video was put out, maybe 92. And in the video, the song is about a kid who gets bullied, neglected by his parents, and acts out. And in the music video, because back then I had this conversation with someone recently, like for a lot of my youth, when I hear a song, the only thing I can do is picture the video in my head, because that was the MTV generation, right? That's over now, but a lot of us are shaking our heads going, yeah, we remember that. You picture the video in your hand. This video was really iconic, and a lot of times it's held up as one of the best music videos ever made, where it depicts Jeremy going through school, right? And at the end of it, and he's being bullied and all this stuff. It's very like kind of artsy. A lot of it's kind of in black and white with some stark colors in it. And one of it where he goes to the front of the classroom at the end of the video, and he kind of makes this motion at everybody. And then the last scenes are everybody kind of going like this with like red paint splattered all over the camera view. Right? And a few years later, started running into a lot of school shootings. I remember one of them in Paducah, Kentucky, was one of the ones that started the spree, and there were several of them where students were shooting in their schools, and ended with, kind of culminating in Columbine, right? But over a few years, you go through this, and Pearl Jam picked up a lot of slack, saying that their video encouraged kids to do this. What I would just very briefly say is that was not encouraging kids to do it. That was a warning. That was a warning. That was a, dare I say, prophecy. It was prophetic. And just like when we have things like Amos today, boy, that's some rough language in there about what, and there, it gets worse, right? About all these things that are going to happen to Israel, which is the northern kingdom of the two kingdoms. That you end up with Israel and Judah when they split after Solomon. That's another long story for another day. But when this happens, Amos is preaching in Israel, and these harsh words remind me something of Pearl Jam's video. They're a warning. It's prophecy. And it reminds me even more of it because even though we didn't see it in the reading today, and we don't see it in here because it's kind of been condensed into a paragraph because it takes up a lot less space, but that's actually poetry. It should be written out in stanzas, but it would have taken a lot more space to do so, so it's good that we didn't do it. But it should be written out in stanzas. It's poetry. It's art. And artists often have that prophetic voice. It's one of those places where they can express themselves in extremes. And this is the kind of thing that Amos and some of the other prophets do. And like I said, Amos may have been the first of the prophets, or at least not first of the prophets necessarily, but the first of the prophets that starts writing things down, or that people start writing his things down. And it seemed to have been the earliest of these prophets that were written down because it looks like some of the other prophets, such as Hosea, who was roughly contemporary with Amos, but maybe just a little bit later, Jeremiah and Isaiah, they all use pieces of Amos. You can see it, copy and paste it pretty much into their books as well. And the other thing about Amos is that this comes at a time of great prosperity in Israel. Like, things are going great for the rich people, for the people that are in power. So how do you think, as a prophet, if you walk into the king's room or you walk out on the streets where all the rich people are, right, in certain areas, and you start saying, oh, we're going down. God's mad at us. How well do you think that's going to go over? It doesn't go over well. A couple of quotes here about the prophets, just so we can put them into context. And this is by Abraham Heschel, who is a Jewish rabbi and scholar. And one of his, I bought a book that's about that thick. It's called The Prophets, and I read it. And on page 5, I already got my money's worth because this quote really sums it up. He says, "Prophecy is the voice that God has lent to the silent agony, a voice to the plundered poor, to the profaned riches of the world. It is a form of living, a crossing point of God and man. God is raging in the prophet's words." And we see that in this. I mean, you see the reasons why God is raging. We focus on the rage sometimes and look at it as this horrible prophetic, fire and brimstone kind of stuff. But look at verse 6 where it says, "They sell the needy for a pair of sandals. Does that remind you of sneakers made in sweatshops? Some things never change, right? Verse 7, where it talks about going into, we won't get into that too much right now, but it kind of sounds like rape. Amos, later on, Amos is raging here about how the rich are treating the poor, the vulnerable in society, the marginalized. This is where this comes from. And later on in verse 6:14, it's not part of our reading, but later on in the book, Amos says that God is going to raise up a nation and send them against you. And this nation turns out to be the Assyrians, although it doesn't say that in Amos yet. It says they're going to come from an area called Hamath, which happens to be a vassal of Assyria. But Assyria, kind of these ancient enemies of Israel, they're going to come and take you over, and they will oppress you. Going to give these people a taste of their own medicine for the way that they've been treating the poor and the vulnerable in their society. Because you see, what the prophets tell us is that injustice has consequences. Has consequences. And Amos is framing the consequences as divine judgment. But let me ask you, where's the line between divine consequences and just simply natural consequences? Amos preaches that the kingdom of Israel will be struck down by another nation, that God will raise up someone to conquer them because of the injustice. But is God really punishing them, or is that just the way injustice works? What are the consequences of not providing justice for your people? How well your army's going to fight when they're oppressed people, where they're a bunch of oppressed poor people that you're asking to fight for you now? How's that going to work? How's your morale in your country going to be? There's not going to be any diversity in leadership, so you're not going to have new ideas about how to handle things. These are just some of the consequences that injustice causes in your nation. So how well is your nation going to stand up to things? In the Middle East, there were times in the ancient Middle East, like for instance in Babylon, where because Babylon gets conquered over and over again and always has the different rulers. There are times when the people threw the doors open to the conquering army and said, "Come on in." Because it was so bad already the way it was. How would that be any different? Is this divine consequences, or is this just natural consequences of causing injustice? In verse 5, it says, "I will send a fire upon Judah." Well, haven't we seen the consequences of injustice in flooding, in poor neighborhoods? This is one of the issues that faith is addressing, by the way. One of the issues that faith has taken up is flooding in poor neighborhoods such as Middleton, especially one of the areas they're focusing on in Daytona. It's had this problem for so many years and they're not doing anything about. Rabbinical tradition says that Amos was killed by King Uzziah, who hit him on the head with a red-hot iron. An apocryphal work says that he was killed by Amaziah's son, who was also a priest. Sometimes it doesn't go so well for people that have prophetic voices. But that doesn't necessarily stop them, right? Because the consequences are too deep. And again, back to Abraham Heschel, that Jewish rabbi, another quote that he has is, "Above all, the prophets remind us of the moral state of a people. Few are guilty, but all are responsible. If we admit that the individual is in some measure conditioned or affected by the spirit of society, an individual's crime discloses society's corruption. In a community not indifferent to suffering, uncompromisingly impatient with cruelty and falsehood, continually concerned for God and every man, crime would be infrequent rather than common." That sounds like restorative justice that is also talked about by faith, right? Now, It also sounds like just a bunch of woke stuff, right? That's just woke stuff. That's, oh, your society's going to take care of your people. There's going to be less crime. Yeah, right. That's just woke stuff. This book was published in 1962. This is his commentary in 1962. It's not modern. It's not new. This book is over 60 years old. Abraham Heschel died over 50 years ago. Right? Because truth is still truth. And the truth of the consequences of justice is still true. Amos uses very graphic imagery of destruction in order to tell the story of people who are unjustly oppressed and marginalized. Why? Because he cares enough about their plight to be controversial. He cares enough about their plight to be a target even. He can't be silent. He needs to point out that the so-called piety of oppressors is abhorrent to God. He's not afraid of attracting the ire of the rich and powerful. He uses a prophetic voice to call out the mistreatment of the poor and uses art, in this case poetry, because almost the entire book is poetry. And he uses that art to make their cries heard. Next week, we'll talk more about Amos's comments on the hypocrisy of the powerful. This week, we're just setting up the depth of his displeasure, which reflects the pain of divine, as God looks down and sees sacramental love being defiled by a lack of human love. For those of you that looked at the letter that I emailed out last week, you may have noticed that it had a quote from Cornel West that said, "Never forget that justice is what love looks like in public." We must make a public display of our support for those who are put down. What do we sing every Sunday morning? You're welcome here. Right? You're welcome here. Everyone is welcome, we say. Do we live into that? A scholar, a public scholar and advocate for people who are homeless. His name's Terence Lester. And he wrote, "Everyone is welcome is drastically different than we built this with you in mind." People do not want to go where they are merely tolerated. They want to go where they are included. Like Amos, we need to learn how to lift up other people's stories. Because behind those stories is where the justice is. Are we on the right side? This is why we are involved with Faith, for example, because they tell the stories of people who had to watch their kids wake up with bite marks because their kids were bitten by rats while they were sleeping. Because of the horrible living conditions and because of the outrageous cost of living and housing costs that they couldn't even go to a better neighborhood if they wanted to, even when they worked multiple jobs. It also tells the stories of people whose neighborhood have flooded 7 times in their lifetime because the city refuses to help provide proper drainage systems. Faith is a bipartisan organization, and you know how much I hate partisanship. If you've ever listened to me, I get tired of it, but we do have to call out injustice when it happens, and it does on both sides at times. But faith is bipartisan. It has nothing to do with politics. It has to do with issues, which is why I think it's important, because we have to be proximate to the people with these stories. We have to get as close as we can with the people that have these stories of injustice. Because the further away, the harder it is for us to feel them. We need to be closer to those that are suffering in our day due to poverty, class discrimination, and those who can't afford rent despite working multiple jobs. Amos would not have been happy to hear the stories that we hear when we go to faith gatherings. And neither are we. That's why we need to bring ourselves closer to those who tell those stories, and we have to find ways to lift them up. We have to be interested only in justice and those people who are suffering. So let's align ourselves properly with the mission of God, who loves all relentlessly and who sent Jesus Christ to declare good news to the poor and sight for the blind and to set captives free from the yoke of justice. And let's all listen to more Pearl Jam. Amen.